You're still watching The Globe on SABC News. Now, Egypt has closed its Rafah border crossing to Gaza after Israel-Hamas escalation. Rafah is the sole crossing between Egypt and Gaza, where an Israeli-led blockade has placed severe restrictions on the movement of goods and people for years. To discuss the latest in this development in Rafah, we're now joined by the Executive Director at the Afro-Middle East Centre, Jeenah. Naeem, thanks very much indeed for joining us. Welcome to the programme.
Thank you, Peter.
This border crossing between Palestine and Egypt has been closed in the past. What's significant about this closure?
Well, it's interesting because there aren't many details about the closure. The Egyptians announced yesterday that it would be closed from today, and then they shut it down today. Officially, they've given no reasons for why they've done so. They've not said when it will be reopened, etc. This is the only border that Gaza has that's not with Israel. So it therefore means that people in Gaza are once again kind of shut in a prison-like situation. They have no borders that they can go through. The sea is controlled by Israel, and they prevent even fishermen from going too far out, as they would think of it. And so people in Gaza are stuck again, without the Egyptians giving many details about why they've done so.
In the past, Egypt has talked about security concerns when it closed this border. What might those concerns be?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, that's the same term that they used this time around as well. They shut the border and said it's for security concerns. There's clearly no security concerns for Egypt itself from Gaza. There's no... They have no fear of any issues from there. But clearly it follows 2 days after what happened in Gaza, as you pointed out, when there was a march to the border of Gaza and Israel. Israeli occupation forces opened fire. 41 Palestinians were injured, and one Israeli soldier, a sniper, was injured when he kind of shot a number of Palestinians through a wall and then was shot in turn. 2 days thereafter, the next day, Egypt decides that it's going to close the border. So there's two possibilities here for why they've done so, for what the term security concern might mean this time around. One is that it's a punishment to Palestinians in Gaza not to take such a strong position against Israel, particularly because the one Israeli soldier was shot. Of course, if he wasn't shot and only 41 Palestinians or 101 Palestinians were shot, the border might not have been closed. But it's punishment for them for the shooting of that soldier and for their kind of assertiveness in having the march to the border, number one. Number two, there's speculation that the talks that Egypt has been mediating between Hamas and Israel regarding a prisoner exchange, that those talks might have faltered, and Egypt is using this to try and put pressure on Hamas to return to the talks and ease their conditions that they've put for the prisoner exchange. So these are the kind of possibilities for why this has happened and why now.
Could Israel be influencing Egypt directly and saying, listen, shut that border?
Oh, yes, that's happened many times before. When there is some kind of incident on the Gaza-Israeli side that Israel asks, I don't think they instruct them, they request, and the Egyptians happily comply, ask them to shut the border, and they do. As I say, usually it's as a way of making the lives of Palestinians in Gaza even more miserable as a punishment.
So what does that mean in terms of Egypt sometimes trying to be a mediator, but it seems that they probably are favouring one side more than the other?
Well, everyone knows that they are close to the Israelis, that they certainly don't like the resistance in Gaza. They have no particular affinity to Hamas or any of the other resistance groups. But in terms of the kind of Arab scenario, most of the Arab countries have basically accepted that Egypt would play that kind of role of mediating at two levels. One is mediation between Israel and Palestinians, whether it's Palestinians in Gaza or the Palestinian Authority when there's need for that. And the other is in terms of mediating between the different Palestinian factions, Fatah, Hamas, etc. And so the other Arab states have essentially left this to Egypt to do, and Egypt very jealously guards this kind of issue. So if any other state wanted to, for whatever reason, play some role, if South Africa, for example, decided that it would like to play a role in facilitating some kind of reconciliation between the Palestinian factions, it would first have to consult with Egypt and get Egypt on board before there'd be any chance of that flying. So this is the kind of position that Egypt has carved out for itself, despite everyone knowing that it's really closer to Israel than to the Palestinians.
Where does this leave Hamas then in terms of expressing itself? Does it then have to pull back some of its activity?
Well, it's not up to only Hamas. I mean, the resistance forces in Gaza are quite a few. Hamas is, of course, the biggest one, but it includes the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, which is a leftist group, Islamic Jihad, and others. Where it leaves them, I don't think that they're going to pull back. I think that this is not an unusual thing for Egypt to shut down the border. It just makes the lives of people more difficult. I mean, I know of a couple of South Africans who have family members there that were preparing to come back and now are stuck, and they don't know when that's going to be able to happen. So it just makes the lives of ordinary people more difficult. It doesn't really make the lives of the political figures or the leaders in the armed groups that much more difficult, because many of them will not travel anyway at risk of their lives. So that's what will happen, and they will sit it out and wait for the siege to be lifted, for the border to be opened, rather. Egypt has given no indication when that might happen. Hamas is already in talks with them, I would guess, begging for it to be opened, so that people wanting medical treatment, students wanting to leave or return, family members, etc., can do so. How long the begging will be and how effective it will be, we'll have to wait and see.
Describe for us what this blockade has meant for the average Gazan.
Well, it's horrific. Firstly, I mean, Gaza is a territory of 360 square kilometers. It's about 36 kilometers in one direction and 10 kilometers in the other. It's a tiny territory. And it has 2 million people, the vast majority of whom are refugees who were kicked out of their homes in 1948 when Israel was created. So already, a big part of Gaza is refugee camps. Over the past, 14 years, since 2007, when Israel imposed the siege on Gaza, you're now looking at a situation where, poverty is close to around 70%, as is unemployment, a huge kind of misery in terms of people getting access to basic foods. Just last week, Egypt stopped two cargoes that were going into Gaza, one carrying chocolates and one carrying ice creams, because they claimed that these chocolates and ice cream would be used by Hamas as a kind of, fundraising or something. So even basic foods, there's the famous statement by an Israeli politician around 2010 or thereabouts, that they are measuring the number of calories that they allow into Gaza, because they don't want to kill the Palestinians in Gaza. They just want to keep them starving. And so it's really quite a horrific kind of siege. And in a sense, it's a form of torture when you're counting calories to ensure that people can just continue living but not live too well. Then, Gaza also has a coastline. And the coastline is patrolled by the Israeli Navy. They, routinely make arbitrary rules about how far fishermen can go out, how far boats can go out, etc. And so oftentimes people are not even able to get food from the sea because of the attacks from the Israeli Navy.
Again, Israel in the past has said that part of the reason of the blockade is to prevent groups like Hamas from smuggling weapons into Gaza and getting materials to build tunnels. Is that what they've done in the past? What is the situation?
Well, clearly in the past, when the siege was in operation and at its worst, in the period when Mubarak was the president of Egypt, for example, and none of the borders were open, there were tunnels dug from Gaza into Egypt. And this was where food and even livestock, etc., was smuggled in because there was no other way of getting that in. I doubt that any weapons were smuggled in through those borders because both from the Egyptian side and the Israeli side, that wouldn't really be possible. And there's very strong kind of patrolling of the coast. Before the siege, yes, there have been weapons that have come into Gaza from outside. But, if you want to pretend that there is such a thing as a Palestinian state, then shouldn't that so-called state have access to its own borders to be able to import and export whatever it wants? What is clear from this is the controls that are put on Gaza, despite Israel claiming that it is not in Gaza and it doesn't have any occupation forces within Gaza itself. Under international law, the closing off of Gaza constitutes part of the occupation. And so Gaza, even though there are no soldiers in that territory, is occupied territory under international law, and which also, of course, in terms of international law, gives the right to the people living in that territory to resist that occupation.
And whilst the Egyptians might cite security concerns, the reality is none of the groups in Gaza are a threat to Egypt and have never been.
No, and they would be very determined not to pose any threat to Israel. They regard the enemy to Egypt rather. They regard the enemy as being Israel, which is the occupying power. And if they have only one other border to exit and to enter Gaza from, and that is with Egypt, they're not going to jeopardize that. So there's no issue of real security concerns from Gaza for Egypt at all.
Beyond Tel Aviv and Cairo, is there anybody else who can help influence the opening of this border? No. I think that the Egyptians make these decisions, and others are wary to kind of try and force their hand on Egypt. What we have seen is the role in Gaza of Qatar, mainly in terms of sending aid. And so just last week there was an approval by and that aid, particularly they send money for the most needy families in Gaza. And when they do, that is usually approved by Israel beforehand. Last week, there was another tranche of money that Israel approved to go to Gaza for these needy families. But no one really is able to impose on the Egyptians, except perhaps, except the Americans. But the Americans are not going to get involved in this. Certainly not now when they have a bigger crisis in Afghanistan. All right, so this recent escalation between Israel and Palestine, is that now subdued? And is this something we'll see again in the future, that it flares up, but unlikely to get to that levels that we saw earlier in the year?
For now, it's subdued, to use your word. I mean, it was supposed to have just been a march. It turned into something else with so many people getting shot, 41 people, as I said. And then that night, after the soldier was shot, that night Israel bombed Gaza. But that was it, and it was kind of over for now. Will it happen again? Most definitely it will. I mean, 2 million people in such a small territory with those kind of poverty levels, they will continue resisting. So you will see other flare-ups taking place. How much of a flare-up and what the consequences will be, we wait to see. But this certainly is not the last.
Naeem, Jeenah, thank you very much indeed for joining us. Your insights always greatly appreciated. Thanks for your time.
Thank you, Peter.